19 to 6. Yeah, it was. Yeah, I was really pleased. I had so many conversations with so many people from pretty much every angle of the circle at City Hall. And I think we came to a place where not only did people feel like we needed to do something, but also by building in that provincial advocacy piece into the motion, I think it really grabbed a lot of people because once again, we're facing a situation where lack of provincial action and or bad provincial laws are leading to a downloading of a major problem onto the city. So ideally, we want the province to fix it. But if they don't, we need to have a real conversation about how we stop evictions into homelessness because not only do they cause tremendous human misery, they end up costing the city. We added 400 shelter beds this winter alone. So more than 3,000 people are either living in shelter or unsheltered right now in our city. So we have to do something. And the easiest way to tackle homelessness is to stop it before it starts. So there was actually one in New Westminster, BC, that I believe came into force in 2019. And what was very interesting was the year after they implemented it, they went from 330 evictions in the 3 years preceding to zero. And that law was challenged at two levels of court, and then the Supreme Court refused to hear the appeal. So that court decision stands. And then the BC government was so impressed with what they were doing, they basically adopted the same rules province wide. And then New Westminster was able to withdraw its bylaw. So I think that's where the impetus is coming from. So Hamilton's bylaw went into effect this January. There's one in Toronto that will go into effect in July. So when we come back to council with the draft bylaw for us to consider, we'll have the New Westminster data, we'll have a year of data out of Hamilton, and we'll have about 6 months out of Toronto. So that will really give us the data that we need to figure out whether the approach that these other cities are taking is effective or not. But early data, from one jurisdiction in New Westminster, BC, seems to tell us that, it's really interesting how landlords are still managing to do repairs without evicting tenants. No, I was just going to say any building built after 2018 actually has no provincially mandated rent control. And the older buildings, they want in on the action, right? So we're seeing situations where tenants are being evicted for what is supposed to be a major renovation, and then people move out and then they see their apartment listed for double the price, and all they've done is paint the walls. And it's happening all the time. We know it is. Yeah, I mean that would be great. I mean, I negotiated something similar when it comes to the upcoming demolition of that building on Bank Street, the former Wallach's building, where I was able to negotiate a memorandum of understanding that offered either a significant cash payout or a slightly lower cash payout and the right to return at same rent. In this case, it was for 15 years, which is amazing. Or yeah, it was 15 years total. But a lot of these things are outside our control. That is something the province would have to institute. So we're saying, look, there are lots of provincial fixes. There were also some changes to the Residential Tenancies Act that were actually proclaimed into law. They received royal assent as part of a bill called Bill 97 that was proclaimed at the end of June 2023, I think, summer 2023. But it was very strange the way it was written. It said to be enacted at a later date, and then that date has never come. And so it's this very strange situation where there are actually strengthened tenant protections and greater fines for landlords contained in those amendments, and they're just sort of hanging there. So the cities of Toronto and Hamilton have both written to the province asking for them to enact those changes. We are planning to do the same thing. And then should that happen, what the scope of what we would need to do as a city would be much different. So yes, in an ideal world, we shouldn't have to consider any sort of additional licensing scheme for renovations. Um, but what we're seeing is, first of all, I mean, we saw a 500% increase in M13 evictions between 2020 and 2023. And that included a year when there was a moratorium on evictions. You can imagine the numbers would be so much higher. Um, as you can, our homelessness problem is absolutely out of control. And, when we had our committee meetings on the two version, the original motion was about 8 months ago. And then again last week, in the next stage of this process, representatives from the mission came and talked about how they have people who end up in shelter. They go through all of the sort of housing readiness programs. They finally get an apartment, and then they're getting renovicted and ending up back in the shelter system, which is a disastrous outcome. And it's not something that any of us want. So we have a problem. And if existing laws aren't solving them, we're giving the province one last chance to do the right thing. And if they don't, we're going to have to consider taking action. The ultimate goal is that this pushes the province to do what it's supposed to do. But it's another one of these scenarios where huge problems have been downloaded on cities and we don't have the tools to solve them. And so every time another person is evicted into homelessness, it costs us because then we're housing them in substandard situations and shelters, which no one likes. It's the erosion of our naturally occurring affordable housing stock. There was a recent study by Carleton professor Steve Pomeroy that showed for every affordable housing apartment under $1,000 or under that we're building, we're losing 31. That is the rate of attrition. So part of this is to get a handle on housing loss, because once that rent is raised, it's raised forever, and that naturally occurring affordable housing goes away. And so, it was one delegate came to committee and said, I didn't know it was legal for someone just to kick people out to make more money. Right. We heard really awful stories. There's a building in Teresa Kavanaugh's ward called Aspen Towers, where the entire building got N13 eviction notices on Canada Day this year. And apparently it was this really convoluted situation. They couldn't even figure out what the name of the new company was. It was some numbered company. And one of the tenants said the only way he could figure out what was going on was he posed as a potential new tenant and went to look at one of the units that they were renting for double the price. And he walked in and all they'd done basically is painted the walls, maybe swapped out the countertop. So we know you can't tell me that that's a renovation that would require the tenant to move out, right? So yeah, I've been really clear. If we're considering some sort of renovation licensing program or bylaw, the cost of doing nothing would have to be much higher than the cost of actually doing something. And that's part of what we want staff to come back with. And I'm working to get more granular data on the cost of each of those evictions into homelessness. Also, we know that the landlord tenant board numbers are a severe undercount, right? Like most people don't report, they're intimidated into leaving. The landlord may or may not have to file the actual N15. They may offer a small amount of cash per keys, and then you're gone and you're just out of the housing market. And people aren't just being pushed out of their neighborhoods, they're being pushed out of the city. Like there's literally nowhere else for them to go. So it's really tough. And the profile of the kind of person that we're seeing who's being most often renovicted in my ward are senior women, often women who live on fixed incomes, who've lived in their apartment for 20 or 30 years and suddenly have nowhere to go. So it's not a dignified way to age. And it's the social contract is falling apart here, right? Like it used to be you work hard, you pay your rent, you have a certain amount of security. These are not bad tenants. These are longstanding tenants in many cases. And building owners and often real estate investment companies figure that they're not lucrative enough and they want to find a way to make them go. It's a symptom of the financialization of housing, and it's creating a crisis that the city ultimately has to deal with. Well, we're already paying for it. We just added 400. We're adding 400 shelter beds this year. Like we're acquiring land, we're buying hotels, we're building. I mean, we cannot keep up with the need right now. And it's interesting because the city of Hamilton, I think, had pretty broad agreement on their renoviction bylaw. Because interestingly, the entire city of Hamilton, I think, has a rate of 40% renters across the whole city, whereas the dynamics of Ottawa are a little bit different. Like a lot of suburban wards are almost entirely homeowners, maybe 10-15% renters, and I have like 50% renters. And it's these older inner urban wards that have this housing stock that's eroding, right? But what I said to my rural colleagues is, when you tell me that we can't build roundabouts that are too skinny because trucks can't get around them, I believe you. And so when I tell you we have a problem primarily in the urban core of seniors being evicted from their homes, I'd like you to believe me too. I mean, either way, this is a problem that the city has to solve. But at the end of the day, I don't think we will be contemplating, or I don't think I would get a successful vote on a licensing scheme unless the financial case was very, very clear. And that's where I actually get along with economic conservatives, because they know, and I know, that the cost of homelessness, allowing it to continue, is more expensive than solving it at the end of the day, right? So, this is not just it's interesting because a lot of councillors said, we really want to crack down on bad actors, but we don't want to add an additional burden to like property owners that do want to improve their property. And I completely get that. What I've said is it depends what the province does next. And what our staff come up with could be a complete made in Ottawa solution. It doesn't have to look exactly like what's going on in Hamilton. And we'll also have data to see how things are working in other jurisdictions. But if it makes a dramatic difference, and if suddenly the light goes off that maybe you don't need to apply for the 913 eviction, maybe you could just do that renovation, keep up your property without kicking out the tenant, that's a good outcome. Yeah, I mean, I just, absolutely, housing is an investment, but it's primarily a human right. It's somebody's home, and property owners are already making a ton of money. Property values are through the roof. You shouldn't have the right to kick out a longstanding tenant who is fulfilling their part of the deal by paying the rent faithfully, just because you want a tenant that's going to pay you more money. Like, that is immoral. Yeah, I mean, I think what I said too is, I voted in favor of the motion for us to explore the idea of a bubble bylaw for vulnerable institutions, even though I don't know where I'm going to land on that bylaw at the end, because when there is a strong public demand for us to take action, it really behooves us to do the work. And that's what my core argument was we need to fully explore this, and we need to put it to bed before the end of this term, because the demand for a renoviction bylaw is not going away, just like the demand for greater protections around schools and religious institutions was not going away. We need to fully explore this from top to tail. We need to decide if the financial case and if the human rights case is there, and then we can say that we fully explored and we met the public demand. And I think it's acceptable, and it's normal, and it's democratic for elected officials to say to staff, you know what, let's move around our work plan a little bit because public demand is changing or because there's an emerging issue. And that's really what my motion was about. So, it was highly unusual to get such a unified vote to support something that fundamentally contradicted a staff recommendation. But my staff worked really hard with city staff and said, what's the real issue here? You say you want more data, and you say you need time to do it. So let's make the time. Tell us what your lowest priority items are, and let's give you a year so we have more data. And that seemed to satisfy them, and we got to a place that we could all live with. So it just goes to show that, you know, sometimes a no is a maybe. Also, I'm very persistent. I think I just tired them out. I just kept coming back to the same arguments. But, I really took the time to call counselors that I don't often talk to, like Alan Hubley voted in favor. He actually said he thought maybe I read The Art of the Deal by Trump, which I have not. But apparently I was a good negotiator. But I really, I think the same logic applies as that bubble bylaw that we voted to explore earlier in the year. And I think nobody wants bad faith evictions to happen. We just need to explore what the best way is to try to fix it.